Some people disappear from powerful rooms so completely that the world forgets they were ever there. But every now and then, someone walks back into the room and remembers. The rain tapped softly against the tall windows of Hawthorne Cafe, turning the Manhattan morning into a blur of silver reflections and passing headlights. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air as conversations mixed with the gentle clink of ceramic cups. Nobody paid much attention to Claire Bennett. They never did. At 29, Claire had mastered the art of being overlooked. Her dark blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her black apron was spotless. Her movements were quiet and precise. She carried trays, refilled cups, wiped tables, and moved through the cafe with the calm efficiency of someone who had done the same job thousands of times before. To most customers, she was simply another waitress. Just another face behind a coffee pot. At a corner table, near the window sat Richard Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Global. His tailored navy suit looked as expensive as the black sedan waiting outside. His silver watch reflected the pale morning light each time he checked the time. He rarely looked up from his phone, rarely noticed the staff, rarely noticed anyone who couldn't influence a deal. This morning mattered. A multinational investment partnership was being discussed. Millions of dollars rested on a single meeting. Richard glanced toward the entrance as two members of his executive team arrived. "The ambassador should be here any minute," one of them said. Richard nodded. "Let's hope he's easier to negotiate with than his reputation suggests." Claire approached their table carrying a coffee carafe. "Would anyone like a refill?" she asked politely. Richard barely looked up. "Just mine." Claire filled the cup with steady hands. Not a drop spilled. Then she moved away, invisible again. 15 minutes later, the front door opened. The room barely reacted. But Richard did. So did every member of his team. Ambassador Victor Reinhardt had arrived. The Swiss diplomat carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades inside rooms where presidents, ministers, and corporate leaders measured every word. His charcoal overcoat was damp from the rain. His silver hair was neatly combed. His expression remained composed as he stepped inside. The manager hurried forward to greet him. Richard stood and extended his hand. "Ambassador Reinhardt, thank you for coming." "Mr. Sterling," Victor replied warmly. "A pleasure." The introductions began. Chairs were pulled back. Documents appeared. Coffee cups were arranged on the table. Then Claire approached once more, carrying a fresh pot. "Good morning," she said softly. "May I offer some coffee?" Victor turned toward the voice. His eyes settled on Claire's face. Everything stopped. The diplomat froze. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for the silence to become noticeable. The conversation died. Richard lowered his hand. One executive exchanged a confused glance with another. Victor stared at Claire as though he had seen a ghost from another life. The coffee pot remained suspended in her hands. Claire's expression did not change. But for the briefest moment, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. The ambassador slowly stood from his chair. The room watched in complete silence. Rain tapped against the glass. A spoon slipped from someone's fingers and landed softly against a saucer. Victor took one step forward, then another. His voice was almost a whisper when he finally spoke. "Miss Bennett." Nobody in the cafe understood why one of Switzerland's most respected diplomats suddenly looked as though he had forgotten an entire billion-dollar meeting. But Claire Bennett did. The silence seemed to stretch far longer than it actually did. A few seconds, maybe less. Yet every person at the table felt it. Victor Reinhardt continued staring at Claire Bennett as if he had suddenly stepped backward into a memory he never expected to revisit. Richard Sterling watched the exchange carefully. He had spent 20 years studying people. Investors, politicians, competitors. He knew surprise when he saw it. This was not ordinary surprise. This was recognition. Genuine recognition. Claire remained perfectly still beside the table. The coffee pot rested lightly in her hands. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her expression calm. The same expression she wore every morning when serving accountants, lawyers, tourists, and executives who rarely remembered her name. But inside, 100 memories had already begun to stir. Geneva, winter mornings. Conference halls filled with translators and diplomats. Long tables covered with documents. Voices speaking in half a dozen languages. A different life. A different version of herself. Victor finally spoke again. "It really is you." His voice carried warmth now. Respect. Almost disbelief. Several nearby customers had stopped pretending not to listen. Richard glanced between them. You know each other? Victor barely took his eyes off Claire. Know each other? A small smile appeared on his face. Years ago, there was hardly a diplomatic meeting in Geneva where people did not know her name. The room became even quieter. Claire lowered her gaze briefly. That was a long time ago, Ambassador. Perhaps, Victor replied. But some people are not easily forgotten. Richard blinked. He looked at Claire again. The woman who brought coffee refills. The woman who quietly stacked plates and swept crumbs from tables. The woman he had never thought about for more than 10 seconds at a time. Something about that image suddenly no longer fit. Claire gently placed fresh coffee beside Victor. Your coffee, sir. You still call me sir. Victor laughed softly. You used to correct senior diplomats when they made translation mistakes. A few people around the table exchanged confused looks. Richard's chief legal officer nearly dropped his pen. Claire offered the smallest smile. Some mistakes needed correcting, and most of us were grateful you noticed them. The ambassador's eyes softened. Especially me. Claire said nothing. She simply adjusted a spoon beside the cup and prepared to step away. Miss Bennet. Victor's voice stopped her again. Would you sit with us for a moment? The request shocked everyone. Not because of the words themselves. Because of who had asked them. Claire hesitated. I am working. You always were. Victor's smile widened. That never stopped you before. Richard studied her face. For the first time, he noticed details he had somehow ignored for months. The confidence hidden beneath her quiet manner. The way she listened before speaking. The way she never seemed rushed, even when the cafe was crowded. None of it felt accidental anymore. Claire glanced toward the counter where the manager stood frozen in confusion. Then she looked back at Victor. Perhaps another time. Victor nodded slowly. You always preferred avoiding attention. Attention rarely improves coffee. The ambassador laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind that made the tension in the room disappear. Yet Richard remained silent. Because one question now echoed through his mind louder than the rain against the windows. If Claire Bennet had once been known in diplomatic circles across Geneva, what on earth was she doing serving coffee in a small Manhattan cafe? The meeting was supposed to begin 10 minutes earlier. Instead, nobody seemed eager to discuss contracts anymore. The thick folder of documents remained unopened in front of Richard Sterling. The financial projections displayed on a tablet screen had been forgotten. Even the executives who normally measured every second of a negotiation now found themselves distracted by a question nobody could answer. Who exactly was Claire Bennet? The ambassador eventually returned to his seat, though his attention continued drifting toward the counter where Claire had resumed her work. She moved through the cafe exactly as before, taking orders, delivering pastries, refilling cups. To anyone walking in off the street, nothing looked unusual. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Once someone had revealed that a person was extraordinary, it became impossible to see them as ordinary again. Richard noticed his chief financial officer staring across the room. You knew about this? Richard asked quietly. Not a thing, the executive admitted. I thought she was just one of the staff. Richard almost laughed. Just one of the staff. An hour ago, he would have said the same thing. Victor Reinhardt folded his hands calmly. Miss Bennet always preferred simple introductions. Richard looked at him. You still have not explained how you know her. The ambassador glanced toward the rain-streaked windows. For a moment, he seemed to be remembering another place entirely. The first time I met Claire was in Geneva nearly 8 years ago. Several heads turned. She was younger than almost everyone in the room. Most people assumed she was an assistant. A faint smile appeared. That assumption lasted about 20 minutes. Richard leaned back slightly. What happened? A translation dispute. Victor lifted his coffee cup. Representatives from 4 countries could not agree on the wording of a document. Hours were being wasted. Tempers were rising. Then Claire quietly pointed out that everyone was arguing over a phrase that had been interpreted incorrectly. He shook his head slowly. One sentence. One misunderstanding. She solved it in less than 2 minutes. The executives exchanged glances. She was a translator? One asked. Much more than that. Victor's voice carried genuine admiration. She understood language. But more importantly, she understood people. Richard looked toward Claire again. She was helping an elderly customer choose between 2 breakfast specials. Her expression remained patient, warm, completely detached from the conversation happening 20 feet away. If she was that talented, Richard said carefully, why is she here? Victor's smile faded slightly. That is not my story to tell. The answer only deepened the mystery. Richard disliked mysteries. In business, unanswered questions usually meant hidden risks or hidden opportunities. Yet something about Claire felt different. There was no performance, no attempt to impress anyone, no hints dropped for attention. If anything, she seemed determined to avoid discussing her past. A young employee approached the table carrying fresh pastries. Compliments of the cafe, he said. Richard barely noticed. His focus remained fixed on Claire. At that exact moment, she looked up from across the room. Their eyes met briefly. Just a second. Long enough for Richard to realize something unexpected. Claire knew they were talking about her. She knew they were curious. Yet she showed no sign of concern. No anxiety. No defensiveness. Only calm. The kind of calm that came from someone who had already made peace with choices other people could not understand. Then she returned to work. As if former diplomats did not recognize her. As if billion-dollar negotiations were not waiting nearby. As if the most important chapter of her life had been closed years ago. Richard watched her disappear through the kitchen doors carrying an empty tray. And for the first time in a very long time, a business deal was no longer the most interesting thing in the room. The meeting eventually moved forward, but not with the momentum Richard Sterling had expected. Numbers were discussed. Market projections appeared on screens. Legal frameworks were reviewed. Yet every few minutes, someone's attention drifted toward the cafe floor. It happened so often that nobody bothered pretending otherwise. Claire Bennett remained the quiet center of a mystery nobody could ignore. The rain outside had softened into a gentle mist by noon. Customers came and went. The lunch crowd began replacing the morning regulars. Through it all, Claire worked with the same calm rhythm. She greeted every customer with patience. Remembered names. Remembered favorite orders. Remembered who preferred cream and who preferred oat milk. It was a strange thing, Richard realized. People often spoke about leadership as if it only happened inside boardrooms. Yet Claire seemed to influence an entire room without ever trying to. You are distracted, Victor Reinhardt said quietly during a break in the negotiations. Richard looked up from a financial report. Am I that obvious? Only to someone who has spent 40 years reading people. Richard allowed himself a faint smile. Then tell me what I am thinking. Victor folded his hands. You want answers? Richard glanced toward the counter where Claire was speaking with an elderly couple. Do not you? Of course. The ambassador took a sip of coffee. The difference is that I learned long ago that some answers arrive when they are ready. Richard was not particularly fond of waiting. Patience was useful in business. Curiosity was dangerous when left unsatisfied. By 1 o'clock, the first stage of the meeting had concluded. Executives stretched their legs. Phones emerged from pockets. Conversations broke into smaller groups. Richard stood near the window reviewing messages when he noticed Claire stepping outside through the side entrance carrying a small paper bag. Without thinking, he watched. Across the street sat an older man beneath a bus shelter. The weather was cool. The sidewalks still glistened from the morning rain. Claire crossed the street and handed him the bag. The man smiled immediately. Even from a distance, Richard could see the gratitude on his face. They spoke briefly. Then Claire returned to the cafe. No announcement. No audience. No expectation of recognition. She simply went back to work. Richard frowned slightly. Most people wanted credit for kindness. Claire seemed determined to avoid it. Minutes later, she returned carrying a tray of drinks. As she passed the meeting table, Victor said softly, "You still do that?" Claire paused. Do what? Take care of people when nobody is watching. For the first time all day, genuine emotion crossed her face. Not surprise. Not embarrassment. Something closer to sadness. Some habits are difficult to lose. Victor nodded slowly. Thankfully, their eyes met for a brief moment. A silent conversation seemed to pass between them. A conversation built from years neither of them mentioned aloud. Then Claire continued toward another table. Richard noticed every detail. The hesitation. The expression. The history hidden beneath simple words. He had spent years evaluating companies. People were more complicated. Much more complicated. One of his executives approached holding a tablet. Richard, we need your approval on the revised figures. Send them to me. The executive hesitated. Can I ask something? Go ahead. Do you think the ambassador was exaggerating? Richard looked across the room again. Claire was helping a young mother settle a restless toddler into a high chair. patient, calm, unremarkable at first glance, yet somehow impossible to stop watching. No, Richard said quietly. I think we have only heard the smallest part of the story. And for the first time that day, he made a decision that had nothing to do with business. Before the week was over, he intended to find out who Claire Bennett really was. The afternoon passed slowly, wrapped in the soft hum of conversations and the aroma of freshly ground coffee. Outside, Manhattan continued moving at its usual pace. Taxis rolled through wet streets. Office workers hurried beneath umbrellas. Inside Hawthorne Cafe, however, a different kind of momentum had begun to build. Richard Sterling finished the final round of discussions with his team, but his attention remained divided. Every time he tried to focus entirely on spreadsheets and forecasts, his thoughts returned to Claire Bennett. It was not merely curiosity anymore. It was confusion. Nothing about her matched the life she appeared to be living. Most people spent years trying to climb toward influence, status, and recognition. Yet according to Victor Reinhardt, Claire had already stood in those rooms and somehow walked away. The question refused to leave him. Why? Shortly after 3 o'clock, the negotiations paused for another break. Several executives stepped outside to answer calls. Others reviewed documents. Victor remained seated near the window, quietly watching the rain-darkened city. Claire approached carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Would you like a refill, Ambassador? She asked. Victor smiled immediately. Only if you stop calling me Ambassador. Old habits, Claire replied. That is exactly what I said earlier. She laughed softly. The sound surprised Richard. It was the first genuine laugh he had heard from her all day. Victor looked up at her. How long has it been? Claire considered the question. Almost 6 years. 6 years. He shook his head slowly. And not once did you contact anyone. That was intentional. The answer was gentle but firm. Victor nodded as though he had expected it. Many people wondered where you went. Claire poured coffee into his cup. People move on. Not always. Victor glanced toward the rain outside. Some people leave an impression that remains long after they are gone. For a brief moment, Claire looked away. Her eyes settled on the window. The reflection staring back seemed older than 29. Wiser. Carrying stories she rarely shared. You give me too much credit. No, Victor said quietly. I do not think I give you enough. Richard pretended to review a document while listening carefully. Every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. Claire finished pouring coffee and started to leave. Then Victor said something unexpected. Do you still have the watch? She froze. Not dramatically, just enough for Richard to notice. Claire slowly looked back. You remember that? Of course I remember. Victor smiled. You carried it everywhere. A faint smile appeared on Claire's face. Different from the polite smiles she offered customers. This one belonged to a memory. Yes, she admitted. I still have it. Victor seemed relieved. Good. Richard watched the exchange with growing fascination. A watch. Such an ordinary object. Yet the way they spoke about it suggested something much larger. Something important. Claire quickly recovered her professional composure. Your meeting will continue soon. Claire. Victor's voice softened. One day you should tell your story. She paused for only a second. It was never my story that mattered. Then she walked away. Victor followed her with his eyes until she disappeared into the kitchen. Richard finally closed the folder in front of him. What does that mean? He asked. Victor looked at him. What? The watch. The story. Everything. The ambassador was silent for several moments. Then he smiled faintly. You are not accustomed to unanswered questions, are you? Richard returned the smile. Not particularly. Victor lifted his coffee cup. Then perhaps you are beginning to understand Claire Bennett. She spent years helping important people solve difficult problems. Yet the moment she could have taken credit for any of it, she stepped aside. Richard looked toward the kitchen doors once more. For reasons he could not explain, he felt as though he was standing at the edge of a story much larger than anyone in the cafe realized. And somewhere inside that story, hidden beneath years of silence, was the reason Claire Bennett had chosen to disappear. By late afternoon, the rain had finally stopped. Pale sunlight pushed through the clouds and reflected against the glass towers surrounding Hawthorne Cafe. The city seemed brighter. The meeting, however, had entered a more difficult phase. The preliminary discussions had gone well, but now the legal details demanded attention. Contracts covered the table. Financial commitments stretched across dozens of pages. Every word mattered. Every sentence carried consequences. Richard Sterling sat at the head of the table reviewing a revised document, while Victor Reinhardt quietly read beside him. Around them, attorneys and advisors compared notes. The atmosphere had become serious again. Yet Claire Bennett remained in Richard's thoughts. The mystery surrounding her had only deepened. Near 4 o'clock, Richard stepped away from the table to answer a call. When he returned, he found Victor standing near the counter. Claire was preparing a fresh batch of coffee beans behind the register. Their conversation was quiet, personal, the kind of conversation people have after years apart. Richard slowed his pace without realizing it. Geneva has changed, Victor was saying. Claire smiled faintly. Everything changes. Not everything. Victor glanced at her carefully. Some names are still remembered. Claire shook her head. You give too much importance to old things. And you give too little. For a moment neither spoke. The cafe noise seemed distant. Cups clinked softly. A milk steamer hissed in the background. Then Victor asked, "Do you ever miss it?" Claire paused while sealing a bag of coffee beans. Sometimes. The answer was almost a whisper. Mostly I miss the people. Victor nodded. They miss you too. Claire looked down at her hands. Richard noticed something unusual. It was the first time all day she appeared uncertain. Not weak. Not emotional. Simply thoughtful. As though a door she had kept closed for years had been nudged open. Life took me somewhere else, she said quietly. That is all. No, Victor's voice remained gentle. Life offered you a choice. And you made it. Claire said nothing. The silence that followed seemed to confirm more than words ever could. Richard returned to the table before either of them noticed him listening. 20 minutes later, the negotiations resumed. Lawyers debated language. Advisors reviewed figures. Then something unexpected happened. One of the international consultants referenced a regulatory framework from Switzerland. The consultant hesitated halfway through his explanation. I cannot remember the exact interpretation, he admitted. The translation is slightly different in English. The room paused. Several people searched their notes. Nobody immediately found the answer. From across the cafe, Claire happened to be delivering a tray to a nearby table. She heard the discussion. She kept walking. Said nothing. Continued serving customers. Yet Richard noticed a brief expression cross Victor's face. Amusement. Quiet amusement. The ambassador knew something nobody else did. A few minutes later, the consultant finally found the document. His interpretation had been slightly wrong. Not enough to create a disaster. Enough to cause confusion. Victor leaned back in his chair and smiled into his coffee. Richard followed his gaze toward Claire. She was already helping another customer, completely unaware of the attention, or perhaps simply pretending to be. For the first time, Richard began to understand something important. Claire was not hiding because she lacked confidence. She was hiding because she had chosen peace over recognition. The realization unsettled him. In his world, success meant being seen, being known, being admired. Claire seemed to value something entirely different. And somehow, that made her even more extraordinary than any accomplishment Victor had described. As the afternoon edged toward evening, the energy inside Hawthorne Cafe shifted once again. The lunch crowd had faded. The rush of customers slowed. Golden sunlight stretched across the wooden floors, painting long shadows beneath tables and chairs. For the first time all day, there was space to breathe. Richard Sterling stood near the window holding his phone, but he was not reading the messages appearing on the screen. His thoughts remained fixed on Claire Bennett. An entire day had passed, yet he still knew almost nothing about her. Not really. He knew what Victor Reinhardt had revealed. He knew she had once worked in circles far beyond this cafe. He knew diplomats remembered her name years after she disappeared. But facts alone never explained a person. What interested him now was the choice. Why would someone leave a life filled with influence and opportunity behind? Across the room, Claire was organizing supplies behind the counter. The movements were familiar, comfortable. She looked exactly where she belonged. Yet Richard could not forget Victor's words. Some names are still remembered. He watched her for several moments before finally approaching. Claire noticed him immediately. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Sterling?" she asked. "Actually, yes." He hesitated. A question. A faint smile touched her face. "Those are usually more complicated than coffee. I am beginning to realize that." Claire folded a towel neatly and waited. Richard searched for the right words. "Do you ever regret it?" The question seemed to surprise even him. Claire looked at him quietly. "Regret what?" Walking away. The cafe grew strangely still around them. Claire glanced toward the window. Outside, People hurried along the sidewalk, carrying shopping bags and briefcases. Everyone seemed to be chasing something. Success, security, recognition, more, always more. Some people assume that success only moves in one direction, she said softly. Up. Richard listened carefully. And you disagree? I think success depends on what you are trying to protect. Her answer lingered between them. Simple, yet somehow heavier than most conversations Richard had inside boardrooms. You make it sound easy. Claire shook her head. It was not. For the first time all day, there was no careful distance in her voice. No polite redirection. Only honesty. The difficult choices rarely feel right when you make them. You understand them later. Richard studied her face. There was no bitterness there. No resentment. Whatever had happened 6 years ago, she had already made peace with it. Victor said people still remember you. Claire laughed quietly. Victor remembers everyone. That is not what he meant. Her smile faded slightly. No, silence followed. Then Richard asked the question that had been following him all day. Who were you? Claire looked directly into his eyes. Not offended. Not defensive. Simply thoughtful. Then she surprised him with her answer. The wrong question is who I was. Richard frowned. Then what is the right question? Claire glanced around the cafe she now called home. The elderly regular reading near the window. The college student working on assignments. The tired nurse grabbing dinner after a long shift. Ordinary people. Ordinary lives. The right question, she said quietly, is who I decided to become. Before Richard could respond, the bell above the entrance door chimed. A new customer entered. Claire offered an apologetic smile and stepped away. The conversation was over. Yet Richard remained standing exactly where he was. Because for the first time that day, he felt closer to the truth. And somehow, the truth seemed far more remarkable than any title Claire Bennett had ever held. The evening lights of Manhattan began appearing one by one beyond the cafe windows. Office towers glowed against the darkening sky. Inside Hawthorne Cafe, the crowd had thinned. The pace slowed. Conversations became quieter. The entire day felt as though it were settling into reflection. Richard Sterling remained longer than he normally would have. His executives had already returned to their offices. The formal negotiations were scheduled to continue the next morning. Even Victor Reinhardt was preparing to leave. Yet Richard found himself reluctant to walk away. There was a feeling he could not shake. The sense that an important piece of a puzzle remained hidden just beyond reach. Victor stood near the entrance, fastening his coat. Claire was clearing a nearby table when he approached her one final time. I leave for Washington tomorrow morning, he said. Claire nodded. Safe travels. You always say that. A faint smile crossed her face. Because I always mean it. Victor hesitated. Then he reached into his coat pocket and removed a small photograph. The edges were slightly worn with age. I found this recently. Claire looked down. For the first time all day, genuine surprise appeared in her eyes. The photograph showed a conference room in Geneva years earlier. Around a long table sat diplomats, advisors, translators, and officials from several countries. Near the center stood a younger Claire. Richard could not see every detail from where he stood, but he noticed something immediately. Everyone in the photograph appeared focused on her. Not the senior officials. Not the dignitaries. Her. Claire stared at the image for several silent seconds. I have not seen this in years, she said softly. Victor nodded. Neither had I. She carefully handed the photograph back. You should keep it. Why? Victor asked. Claire smiled. Because it belongs to your memories now. Victor laughed quietly. You really have not changed. As he slipped the photograph away, Richard finally approached. May I ask something? Both turned toward him. Of course, Victor replied. Richard looked directly at the ambassador. You said people remembered Claire. How important was she, really? The question hung in the air. Claire immediately looked uncomfortable. Victor noticed. So did Richard. For a moment, the diplomat seemed to weigh his answer carefully. Then he spoke. 6 years ago, there was a negotiation involving multiple governments, several international organizations, and months of diplomatic work. Richard listened closely. Everyone expected it to fail. Victor glanced toward Claire. Then one person found a solution nobody else could see. Claire lowered her eyes. Victor, you know it is true. His voice remained calm. The agreement succeeded because Claire understood something the rest of us missed. Richard frowned slightly. What did she understand? Victor smiled. That people rarely fight over words. They fight over what they believe those words mean. Silence followed. Even the sounds of the cafe seemed distant. Richard slowly absorbed the answer. It was exactly the kind of observation that could save a negotiation. Not language alone. Human nature. Claire picked up an empty cup from the table. You make it sound more dramatic than it was. No, Victor replied. You simply refused to take credit. Then he opened the door and stepped into the cool Manhattan evening. Claire stood motionless for a moment, watching him disappear into the crowd. The door closed. The bell chimed softly overhead. And for the first time since meeting her, Richard realized something extraordinary. Everyone who spoke about Claire described her accomplishments. Yet Claire herself never mentioned a single one. It was as though she had spent 6 years deliberately shrinking a story that others still considered remarkable. The next morning arrived with clear skies and a sharp spring breeze moving between the buildings of Manhattan. Hawthorne Cafe opened before sunrise, just as it always did. The scent of fresh coffee filled the room. The chairs were arranged. The lights glowed warmly against the quiet streets outside. Claire Bennett arrived 20 minutes early. She unlocked the supply cabinet, checked inventory, and prepared the first pots of coffee before the city fully awakened. Routine had become a kind of peace. Predictable, steady, simple. By 8 o'clock, however, the calm atmosphere began to change. Richard Sterling and his team returned for the second day of negotiations. The final agreements would be reviewed that morning. If everything proceeded smoothly, months of planning would conclude before noon. Richard entered carrying a folder thick with revised documents. His legal advisors followed close behind. Something about their expressions immediately felt different. More tense, more focused. Claire noticed it the moment they sat down. Rough morning? She asked while pouring coffee. Richard looked up briefly. You could say that. Before she could ask another question, one of the attorneys spoke. There is an issue with the revised language from Zurich. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. A significant issue. Claire quietly finished pouring coffee and stepped away. Yet she could not help hearing fragments of the discussion as she moved between tables. A late revision. A disputed interpretation. Conflicting obligations. The kind of problem that seemed small until millions of dollars depended on it. Across the room, several executives reviewed documents with growing concern. Phones appeared. Calls were made. The atmosphere became increasingly strained. Richard remained calm on the surface, but Claire could see the signs. The tightened shoulders. The shorter responses. The way he kept rereading the same page. An hour passed. Then another. The problem refused to disappear. Shortly before 11 o'clock, one of the consultants arrived carrying additional paperwork from overseas. The translation matches the original submission, he insisted. Then why does the compliance language contradict the amendment? Another advisor asked. Nobody seemed certain. The discussion circled endlessly. Definitions. Interpretations. Legal terminology. Claire delivered pastries to a nearby table and continued listening unintentionally. Something felt wrong. Not the disagreement itself. The assumption underneath it. She heard a particular phrase repeated several times. Each time, a faint feeling of recognition stirred somewhere in the back of her mind. She continued working, continued serving customers, continued telling herself it was not her place to interfere. Yet the phrase returned again and again. Finally, as she carried empty cups toward the kitchen, she glanced toward the document lying open near Richard's elbow. Only for a second. One brief glance. The moment her eyes landed on the page, she stopped walking. Not because she wanted to. Because she suddenly understood the source of the confusion. The issue was not the translation. It was the context. One word had been interpreted according to modern commercial usage, when the original Swiss regulatory language referenced an older legal definition still recognized in specific jurisdictions. The distinction was subtle, easy to miss, yet potentially important. Claire stood motionless beside the service station. The familiar choice appeared before her once again. Stay silent. Continue living the quiet life she had carefully built. Or step forward and risk reopening a world she had spent 6 years leaving behind. Across the room, Richard Sterling rubbed his forehead and stared at the document with growing frustration. Around him, experts continued debating a problem that suddenly seemed remarkably simple. Claire lowered her eyes, then slowly looked back at the table. The decision she had avoided for years was beginning to find its way back to her. Claire Bennett stood behind the service station, holding an empty tray while the discussion continued across the room. Voices rose and fell. Pages turned. Consultants referenced regulations. Attorneys compared interpretations. Yet the answer remained hidden beneath layers of increasingly complicated analysis. Claire knew that feeling. She remembered conference rooms in Geneva where dozens of intelligent people spent hours searching for solutions that were sitting quietly in plain sight. The challenge was rarely knowledge. The challenge was perspective. She looked down at the tray in her hands. 6 years. 6 years of choosing silence. 6 years of building a life that asked nothing from anyone and demanded nothing in return. It had been peaceful, honest, simple. The thought should have made the decision easier. Instead, it made it harder, because she could already see where the current misunderstanding was leading. Richard Sterling sat motionless at the table. The confidence that usually defined him had not disappeared, but it was being tested. Every proposal created a new complication. Every clarification seemed to generate another question. Around him, highly qualified professionals continued debating the same paragraph. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Then she set the tray down. When she opened them again, she had already made her choice. She walked toward the table carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Nobody paid much attention at first. She refilled one cup, then another. The discussion continued uninterrupted. Finally, she stopped beside Richard. "Excuse me," she said softly. The conversation paused. Several heads turned. Richard looked up. "Yes." Claire hesitated for only a second. "I apologize if I am mistaken." Every eye in the room settled on her. "But I do not believe the problem is the translation." Silence followed. One of the attorneys frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Claire kept her voice calm. "The translation is technically correct. The interpretation is not." Richard slowly sat back in his chair. "Go on." Claire glanced at the document. The disputed term is being read according to its modern commercial usage. One consultant immediately shook his head. "That is the accepted interpretation." Claire nodded respectfully. "In most cases, yes." Then she pointed gently toward a specific section. "Except this regulation was originally drafted under an older Swiss legal framework. In that context, the word carries a narrower definition." The room became completely silent. Several people immediately looked back at the document. One attorney began turning pages. Another opened a digital reference database. Nobody spoke for nearly 30 seconds. Then the senior consultant suddenly froze. "Wait." He leaned closer to the screen. His eyes widened. "She is right." Richard looked between them. "What?" The consultant swallowed. "The historical definition changes the entire interpretation of the amendment." Another attorney quickly reviewed the reference. "It removes the contradiction." A third advisor looked up from his notes. "The compliance issue disappears." For a moment, nobody seemed able to process what had happened. Hours of debate, resolved in less than 2 minutes. Claire immediately stepped back. "I am sorry for interrupting." Richard stared at her. Not with surprise anymore. Something deeper. Recognition. Respect. Across the table, one of the attorneys asked quietly, "How did you know that?" Claire offered a small smile. The same calm smile she used with customers ordering coffee. "Because 6 years ago, I made the exact same mistake." Then she turned and walked back toward the counter before anyone could stop her. Behind her, the room remained silent. Not because there was nothing left to say, because everyone had just witnessed something they would remember for a very long time. For several seconds after Claire walked away, nobody moved. The document remained open on the table. The corrected interpretation sat plainly on the page, obvious now that someone had pointed it out. Yet what lingered in the room was not the solution itself. It was the person who had found it. One attorney slowly removed his glasses. Another leaned back in his chair. The consultant who had spent most of the morning defending the previous interpretation stared toward the counter in disbelief. Richard Sterling remained silent. He watched Claire return to work as though nothing unusual had happened. She greeted a customer, cleared a table, refilled a sugar dispenser. The same woman who had just resolved a problem that had occupied an entire team of specialists was now arranging napkins beside a pastry display. The contrast felt almost impossible to comprehend. "She really did this before, did she not?" one advisor finally asked. No one answered immediately. They did not need to. The answer had become obvious. Richard closed the document and stood. The negotiations could continue now. The obstacle had been removed. Yet something far more important demanded his attention. He crossed the cafe and stopped near the counter. Claire was entering an order into the register. She looked up when she sensed him approaching. Is the issue resolved? She asked. Richard almost laughed. You know it is. Claire nodded once. That is good. That is all you have to say? She looked genuinely confused. What else should I say? Richard studied her face. No pride. No expectation of praise. No satisfaction at being proven right. Only quiet professionalism. You saved the agreement. Claire shook her head. No. The agreement was already there. Everyone else did the difficult work. I only noticed something they missed. Most people would not describe that as only. A faint smile touched her lips. Most people enjoy attention more than I do. Richard looked away briefly. Through the front windows, sunlight reflected off the surrounding skyscrapers. People hurried along the sidewalks below. Every day, thousands chased promotions, titles, recognition. Yet Claire seemed to have stepped away from that race entirely. Victor was right about you, he said quietly. Her expression softened. Victor sees the best in people. Perhaps, but I think he was also telling the truth. Claire became silent. For a moment, she appeared tired. Not physically tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from carrying memories for a long time. Richard noticed it immediately. Then he noticed something else. Hanging beneath the collar of her blouse was a thin silver chain. Attached to it was a watch. Small, elegant, Swiss. The same watch Victor had mentioned the previous day. Claire saw where his eyes had drifted. Instinctively, her fingers touched the watch. A protective gesture. Familiar. Personal. The watch, Richard said carefully. It matters to you. Claire looked down at it for a moment. The noise of the cafe seemed to fade around her. Yes, she said softly. Very much. Was it a gift? She nodded. From my mother. The answer carried a weight that immediately changed the conversation. Richard said nothing. Claire continued looking at the watch. She used to tell me that people spend too much time trying to be important. A faint smile appeared. Sad and warm at the same time. She believed it was better to be useful. Richard understood then. Not everything. Not even close. But enough. Enough to realize that whatever had pulled Claire away from her former life had never been about failure. It had been about love. And suddenly, for the first time, the mystery of Claire Bennett no longer felt tragic. It felt noble. The negotiations concluded shortly after noon. Months of preparation, countless meetings, and thousands of pages of documentation finally came together in a single agreement. Handshakes were exchanged. Smiles appeared around the table. Relief settled over the room. Yet what people remembered most was not the contract itself. It was the moment a quiet waitress had solved a problem that an entire team of experts had overlooked. Word traveled faster than anyone expected. By early afternoon, several people involved in the negotiations had already shared the story with colleagues. A few called it remarkable. Others called it unbelievable. Claire Bennett called it Tuesday. She continued working exactly as she had the day before. She carried trays, refilled coffee cups, wiped tables. The extraordinary moment seemed to belong to everyone except her. Richard Sterling noticed this more than anyone. For years he had lived in a world where success demanded celebration. Victories were announced. Promotions were publicized. Achievements became headlines. Yet Claire behaved as though none of it mattered. Around 3 o'clock, a young associate from Richard's company approached the counter. He looked nervous. Miss Bennett. Claire looked up. Yes. I just wanted to thank you. She smiled politely. For what? The young man blinked. For helping save the agreement. Claire laughed softly. You are giving me too much credit. No, I do not think I am. He hesitated. I hope someday I know half as much as you. Claire's expression changed slightly. Warmer now. More personal. Then let me give you some advice. The associate immediately listened. Learn something every day, even when nobody notices. He nodded. That is it. That is enough. The young man left smiling. Richard had witnessed the entire exchange from a nearby table. Once again, Claire had transformed attention into encouragement, praise into perspective. She never kept any of it for herself. Later that afternoon, as the final members of Richard's team prepared to leave, he walked toward the counter carrying a small envelope. Claire looked up from organizing receipts. Another question? She asked. Richard smiled. Actually, something else. He placed the envelope on the counter. Claire glanced at it, but did not touch it. What is it? A job offer. The words hung between them. Several nearby employees immediately looked over. Richard continued. Not a symbolic offer. Not a favor. A serious position. Claire remained silent. You could help lead international negotiations for Sterling Global. The compensation would be substantial. The opportunities even more so. The cafe seemed unusually quiet. Richard waited. Claire looked at the envelope, then at the customers sitting throughout the room. The regulars she knew by name. The staff she worked beside every day. The familiar life she had carefully built. Finally, she looked back at Richard. That is very generous. It is deserved. Claire smiled gently. You still think this is about titles? Richard frowned slightly. What if it is about potential? She considered that. Then her fingers lightly touched the silver watch resting against her collarbone. My mother used to tell me something. Richard waited. She said the world will always offer you bigger stages. Claire's eyes drifted across the cafe. The difficult part is deciding where you are needed most. Richard followed her gaze. For the first time, he truly saw what she saw. Not a small cafe. Not a modest job. A place where she had chosen to be present. Useful. Kind. Important in ways no resume could measure. And suddenly, for the first time in his life, Richard Sterling found himself questioning whether success and significance were actually the same thing. The sun was beginning to set when the last members of Richard Sterling's team finally left Hawthorne Cafe. The long negotiation was over. The documents had been signed. The uncertainty had disappeared. Yet what remained with Richard was not the agreement. It was a conversation. A quiet woman standing behind a counter. A silver watch resting against her collarbone. A life measured not by titles, but by purpose. Claire Bennett continued cleaning tables as she always did. The evening crowd had started arriving. Familiar faces entered through the front door. A retired teacher who came every Thursday. A young couple studying for graduate exams. A nurse finishing a 12-hour shift. Claire greeted each of them by name. She remembered their usual orders. She remembered the details that made people feel seen. Richard watched from across the room. For the first time, he understood something he had spent years overlooking. Influence was not always loud. Importance was not always visible. Some people changed the world from conference stages. Others changed it one conversation at a time. He walked toward the counter carrying the envelope he had offered earlier. Without a word, he placed it back into his briefcase. Claire noticed. You are taking it back? She asked with a gentle smile. Richard nodded. I am. Are you disappointed? He thought about the question. Then he looked around the cafe. No, Claire waited. Richard smiled. I think I finally understand why you stayed. For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of the cafe filled the silence. Cups clinking softly. Quiet conversations. The steady rhythm of ordinary life. Then Richard extended his hand. Not to a waitress. Not to a former diplomat. Simply to Claire. She shook it. Thank you, he said. Claire tilted her head slightly. For what? Richard glanced toward the windows where the last light of day reflected against the glass. For reminding me that success is not the same as significance. Claire smiled. A real smile. Warm and unguarded. The kind that appeared only when someone truly understood. After Richard left, the cafe returned to normal. The customers talked. The coffee brewed. The city moved forward. Claire picked up a tray and carried fresh cups to a nearby table. Nobody applauded. Nobody announced her accomplishments. Nobody needed to. The people who mattered had already seen her. And perhaps that was enough. Somewhere beyond the crowded streets of Manhattan, diplomats still remembered her name. Executives still talked about the woman who solved a problem nobody else could solve. But Claire Bennett simply poured coffee and listened to people tell stories about their day. Because the life she had chosen was not smaller than the one she left behind. It was simply different. Her mother had been right. The world would always offer bigger stages. The harder question was where a person was needed most. And Claire had answered that question long ago. Not with words, with the way she lived. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones standing in the spotlight. They are the ones who quietly step away from it, carrying their dignity with them. If this story meant something to you, share the moment that stayed with you the longest in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about quiet courage, hidden wisdom, and the people who change lives without asking for recognition, we would be honored to have you join us for the next one.